Number 1. Andrea Yates, the mother who lost herself before she lost everything else. There are cases in true crime that stay with people for years, not because of mystery, but because of the profound tragedy at their center, a tragedy that raises questions about how a family, a medical system, and a society can all look in a certain direction and still fail to see what is breaking apart right in front of them. The story of Andrea Yates is one of those cases. It is a story about a woman who was once described by everyone who knew her as devoted, gentle, and deeply caring. A former swim team captain, a nurse who had spent years of her professional life looking after others, someone who by every outward measure seemed to pour her entire self into the people around her. Andrea Kennedy was born in 1964 in Houston, Texas, and grew up in a household where achievement and discipline were deeply valued. She excelled academically, graduating as valedictorian of her high school class, went on to study nursing at the University of Houston, and spent 8 years working in oncology at a Houston cancer center. By the mid-1990s, she had married Russell Yates, a NASA engineer, and the two of them began building a life together in the suburbs of Houston. They shared a deep religious faith and a vision of a large family, and in the years that followed they welcomed 5 children: Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary, each of whom became the center of Andrea's daily existence. What those who admired her life from the outside did not always see was the weight she was carrying beneath the surface. Before the events that would define her story publicly, Andrea had been hospitalized 3 times for psychiatric issues. She had experienced psychotic breaks with auditory and visual hallucinations, had severe depressive symptoms, and had attempted to end her own life on more than one occasion. These were not hidden facts. They were documented in medical records and known to her doctors and her husband. Yet the household continued to grow. The family eventually came under the influence of an itinerant preacher whose teachings placed an enormous spiritual weight on the idea of perfect motherhood and radical self-sacrifice, and that ideological pressure added a particular kind of burden to an already fragile psychological foundation. In June of 2001, law enforcement received a call from Andrea Yates requesting help at her home in Clear Lake, a suburb of Houston. When officers arrived, they found all 5 of her children had passed away. She had placed each child, one by one, in the family bathtub and held them beneath the water. She did not flee. She did not attempt to conceal what had happened. She waited for the police to arrive and told them what she had done. In the immediate aftermath, investigators and the public struggled deeply to understand what could possibly explain a mother doing this to the 5 children she had spent years raising and holding through the night. Prosecutors charged Andrea with capital murder and initially sought the death penalty, arguing she had known what she was doing was wrong. The defense entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, presenting the portrait of a woman who, in the grip of severe psychosis, had come to believe that she was protecting her children, that she herself had become corrupted by Satan, and that her children would face eternal consequences because of her influence over them. The 2002 trial resulted in a guilty verdict, but that verdict was later overturned on appeal after it was revealed that a prosecution expert witness had provided false testimony, claiming that a television drama had aired an episode depicting a mother drowning her children and using an insanity defense when no such episode had ever existed. With that testimony discredited, a new trial was granted. At the 2006 retrial, a Texas jury found Andrea Yates not guilty by reason of insanity. The panel deliberated for approximately 13 hours over 3 days, before concluding that she had not known her actions were wrong at the time she committed them. Following the verdict, Andrea was transferred to Vernon State Hospital, a maximum security psychiatric facility in North Texas, where she has remained in treatment ever since. The case permanently changed how postpartum psychiatric illness is discussed and treated across the United States, forcing a national conversation about how religious and cultural expectations of motherhood can prevent women from seeking help, and about what happens when a mental health system fails to intervene before a tragedy becomes irreversible. Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary deserve to grow up, and their story left behind a question that medicine and law are still working to answer. How do we recognize in time when someone's mind is taking them somewhere they cannot return from alone? Number 2. Susan Smith, the mother who made the whole nation search for a story that was never true. On the evening of October 25, 1994, a young woman drove to the edge of John D. Long Lake in Union, South Carolina, and made a choice that would not only end the lives of her two small sons but would also set in motion one of the most painful public deceptions in American criminal history. Susan Smith was 22 years old that night. Her sons, 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alexander, were strapped into their car seats in the back of her burgundy Mazda. She released the handbrake and let the car roll down the boat ramp and into the dark water of the lake, and she stood at the edge as the car slowly disappeared beneath the surface. It took approximately 6 minutes for the water to fill the car completely. Then she walked away. What followed those 6 minutes was 9 days of extraordinary national attention. 9 days during which Susan Smith appeared on television, tears streaming down her face, pleading for the safe return of her two little boys, describing how a man had forced his way into her car at a red light, demanded she drive, and then forced her out of the vehicle before speeding away with her children still inside. She described the man as a black male wearing a dark knit cap. Law enforcement launched a massive search. Communities across South Carolina mobilized. The nation watched and grieved alongside a young mother who looked by every external sign like a woman destroyed by loss. Union County Sheriff Howard Wells, who had known Susan Smith her entire life, was among those leading the investigation. From very early on, the details of her story did not hold together the way they should have. The intersection she described where the incident supposedly occurred was controlled by a traffic light that operated on a sensor and would not have turned red for an approaching vehicle at that hour unless another car was present. And there was no evidence of another car. Investigators noted inconsistencies in her emotional responses during interviews, moments where her demeanor shifted in ways that did not align with the story she was telling. Meanwhile, every lead generated by her description of the alleged individual came to nothing. 9 days after the boys disappeared, on November 3, 1994, Susan Smith sat down with Sheriff Wells and after a long conversation finally told him the truth. The boys had not been taken by anyone. She had let the car roll into the lake herself. She told investigators that she had been going through severe emotional turmoil at the time. She was dealing with the breakdown of a relationship with a man who had written her a letter saying he was not ready for a relationship that involved children, and she had felt in that moment that she had no way forward. The boys were found the following day. Susan Smith was charged with 2 counts of murder. At trial in July 1995, prosecutors sought the death penalty, arguing the crime had been deliberate and calculated. The defense presented a picture of a deeply troubled woman with a history of depression and childhood trauma, who had been in profound psychological pain at the time of the crime. The jury convicted Susan Smith of 2 counts of murder on July 22, 1995, but declined to sentence her to death. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole and began her sentence on November 4, 1994 at Leith Correctional Institution in South Carolina. In November 2024, more than 30 years after the crime, Susan Smith appeared before a South Carolina parole board for the very first time. Her ex-husband David Smith attended the hearing and asked the board to deny her release. The board voted unanimously to keep her incarcerated. She will be eligible for another hearing in 2026. Michael Daniel Smith and Alexander Tyler Smith never had the chance to grow up, and the 9 days during which the nation searched for them on the basis of a story that was never true left a particular kind of grief behind, one that extended far beyond a single family into every community that had prayed, hoped, and believed. Number 3. Diane Downs, the mother who invented a stranger to take the blame. On the night of May 19, 1983, a car pulled into the emergency bay of Mackenzie Willamette Hospital in Springfield, Oregon, and a young woman got out telling hospital staff that a stranger had flagged her down on a rural road, attempted to take her car, and shot her and her 3 children before running away into the darkness. The woman was Elizabeth Diane Downs, a 27-year-old divorced postal worker. The children in the back of her car were Christy, 8 years old, Cheryl, 7, and Danny, 3. When emergency room staff reached the children, Cheryl had already passed away. Christy and Danny were alive but in critical condition. Christy had suffered a disabling stroke from her injuries, and Danny would be left paralyzed from the waist down. Diane herself had a gunshot wound to her left forearm, which was not life-threatening. The picture she painted for investigators that night was of a dark road, a bushy-haired stranger, and a violent random encounter. What investigators would piece together over the months that followed told an entirely different story. Detective Doug Welch, who responded to the hospital that night and went on to lead the investigation, later described his immediate unease with the way Diane Downs presented herself. She was composed in a way that felt out of place for the circumstances. She was talkative and calm when the medical staff around her were in crisis mode trying to save her children. In the days that followed, her demeanor in interviews continued to unsettle investigators. A significant break in the case came when investigators discovered Diane's personal diaries. Those diaries revealed an obsessive attachment to a married man in Arizona, a man who had made it clear that he did not want to be a father figure to anyone's children. Investigators came to believe that the motive for what had happened on that rural road was rooted in that relationship, that Diane had come to see her children as the obstacle standing between her and the future she wanted with this man. The investigation lasted 9 months. Diane was taken into custody on February 28, 1984. In a development that stunned those following the case, by the time her trial began in May of that year, Diane was visibly pregnant again. A pregnancy she had deliberately sought, and which she discussed openly in media interviews, saying she missed her children and had wanted to bring a new baby into the world. The trial itself turned significantly on the testimony of Christy Downs, who had undergone months of intensive physical therapy and rehabilitation in order to be able to take the stand. Christy told the jury who had been responsible for what happened to her family that night. The jury found Diane Downs guilty, and she was sentenced to life in prison plus 50 years. Between the verdict and the formal sentencing, the court paused so that Diane could give birth to a daughter she named Amy Elizabeth. The baby was immediately taken into state custody and later adopted by a family who renamed her Becky Babcock. In 1987, just 3 years into her sentence, Diane Downs escaped from the Oregon Correctional Facility, where she was being held, and remained free for 2 weeks before police located her at a home just blocks from the prison. She was taken back into custody and transferred to a more secure facility. She has continued to maintain her innocence throughout her decades of incarceration and has been denied parole on multiple occasions. She currently remains in custody in California. Christy and Danny Downs survived, though both carried lasting physical consequences from that night. Cheryl Lynn Downs was 7 years old, and the only stranger on that road was the one her mother invented. Number 4, Casey Anthony, the case that divided a nation and left no final answers. In the summer of 2008, a 2-year-old girl named Kaylee Marie Anthony went missing in Orlando, Florida, and the details that emerged around her disappearance over the weeks and months that followed created one of the most discussed and debated criminal cases in modern American history. Kaylee's mother, Casey Anthony, was 22 years old at the time. On July 15, 2008, it was Kaylee's grandmother, Cindy Anthony, who called 911 to report the child missing, not Casey. 31 days had passed between the last confirmed sighting of Kaylee alive and the moment that call was made. During those 31 days, Casey Anthony had been photographed at parties and social gatherings, living what appeared from the outside to be a completely ordinary life. When investigators began questioning Casey about where Kaylee was, she gave them a series of explanations that did not hold up. She told them that a nanny named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez had been caring for Kaylee and had taken her. Investigators could find no verifiable connection between anyone by that name and the Anthony family. She gave them a workplace address where she claimed to have recently been employed. She had not worked there for years. On December 11, 2008, the skeletal remains of a small child were found in a wooded area less than half a mile from the Anthony family home. Those remains were confirmed to be Kaylee Anthony. The cause of death was ruled a homicide, though the specific manner could not be conclusively determined due to the condition of the remains. Casey Anthony was charged with first-degree murder. The prosecution argued that Casey had used chloroform to sedate Kaylee and then used duct tape to cause her death, presenting the theory that Casey wanted to be free of the responsibilities of raising a child. They pointed to searches on the family computer for information about chloroform, to the odor of decomposition detected in the trunk of Casey's car, and to those 31 days of silence. The defense argued that Kaylee had accidentally drowned in the family's backyard swimming pool and that Casey's father, George Anthony, had discovered the child and helped conceal what had happened, with Casey's unusual behavior in the aftermath being the result of a lifetime of family trauma and dysfunction. The trial began in May 2011 and lasted nearly 6 weeks. On July 5, 2011, after deliberating for approximately 10 hours and 40 minutes, The jury returned a verdict of not guilty on the charges of first-degree murder, aggravated manslaughter, and aggravated child abuse. They found Casey guilty on 4 misdemeanor counts of providing false information to law enforcement. She was sentenced to 4 years with credit for time already served and was released on July 17, 2011. The case generated a level of public reaction that few criminal trials in American history have matched. People who had followed every day of the proceedings felt a profound sense of disbelief at the outcome, and debates about what actually happened to Kaylee Marie Anthony have never truly stopped. What is known is that a 2-year-old child is gone, that the truth of what happened to her has never been established in a court of law, and that the questions her case leaves behind have no clean or comfortable resolution. Number 5. Lacey Spears, the mother who blogged about her son's suffering while she was causing it. The story of Lacey Spears and her son Garnett Paul Spears is one of the most deeply unsettling cases of its kind in recent American history, in part because of how completely ordinary the surface of their life appeared to everyone who knew them. Lacey Spears presented herself to the world as a fiercely devoted single mother, a young woman who had dedicated herself entirely to the care of her chronically ill son, who documented their journey through illness and hospitalization on social media, and a blog that drew a following of people who admired her apparent strength and selflessness. For years, friends, family members, medical staff, and online followers watched Lacey care for Garnett through one health crisis after another, accompanying him to hospitals, sitting at his bedside, and writing posts about her love for him that many people found genuinely moving. What none of them knew, what would only become clear after Garnett died, was that the source of his suffering was the very person who appeared to be fighting hardest to keep him alive. Garnett Paul Spears was born in 2008. From very early in his life, he was presented by Lacey as a child with serious medical needs. He was given a surgically implanted stomach feeding tube when he was a toddler, a procedure that his doctors later said they would not have approved had they known the full picture. Over the course of his short life, Garnett was hospitalized repeatedly, subjected to numerous medical procedures, and monitored by teams of doctors who were working from a medical history provided almost entirely by his mother. That history, as investigators would eventually determine, was built on a foundation that did not reflect what was actually wrong with Garnett, because what was actually wrong with Garnett was that his mother was making him sick. In January 2014, Lacey brought Garnett, then 5 years old, to Nyack Hospital in Rockland County, New York, reporting that he was experiencing seizures. While he was hospitalized, his sodium levels rose to an extraordinarily dangerous level with no medical explanation that doctors could identify. He was transferred by medical helicopter to Westchester Medical Center. Hospital surveillance footage captured Lacey taking Garnett into a bathroom on 2 separate occasions while he was connected to his feeding tube, and on each occasion Garnett's condition worsened significantly afterward. Doctors at Westchester Medical Center grew alarmed and contacted Child Protective Services. Garnett Paul Spears passed away on January 23, 2014. He was 5 years old. The investigation that followed determined that he had been poisoned with extremely high concentrations of sodium administered through his stomach tube. Lacey Spears was arrested 5 months after Garnett's death. She was indicted on charges of second-degree depraved murder and first-degree manslaughter. At trial, prosecutors argued that Lacey had craved the attention that Garnett's illnesses brought her, from family, from friends, from medical professionals, and from her online followers, and that she had eventually taken his life because she feared he was becoming old enough to tell people what was happening to him. Several doctors testified that there was absolutely no medical explanation for the spike in Garnett's sodium levels that had caused his death, and that the only person who could have administered the sodium was Lacey. The jury found Lacey Spears guilty of second-degree murder on March 2, 2015. On April 8, 2015, she was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. The judge acknowledged that she suffered from a mental illness but stated that the crime was unfathomable in its cruelty. Garnett Paul Spears spent his entire short life being cared for by a mother who was simultaneously the cause of everything he suffered, and the blog posts she wrote about how much she loved him remain online, a record of a performance that cost a 5-year-old boy everything he had. Number 6. Darlie Routier, the mother whose sons were taken in the night and whose case has never stopped being argued. In the early morning hours of June 6, 1996, emergency dispatchers in Rowlett, Texas received a call from a young woman who was screaming that someone had broken into her home and attacked her and her children. The woman was Darlie Routier, 26 years old. And when police arrived at the Routier home, they found an appalling scene. 6-year-old Devin Routier was already gone from his injuries. 5-year-old Damon Routier was rushed to hospital but passed away before reaching it. Darlie herself had injuries to her throat and right arm. Her husband Darren and their infant son Drake, who had been sleeping upstairs, were unharmed. Darlie told investigators that an intruder had come into the home while she and the boys were sleeping in the living room, that she had briefly awakened and seen a figure walking away from her toward the utility room, and that by the time she had processed what was happening and turned on the lights, she found that she and the boys had been attacked. Police found a window screen in the garage that appeared to have been cut, suggesting a possible point of entry. They also found a bloody sock in the alley behind the home, which Darlie's supporters have long pointed to as evidence of an intruder leaving the property. In the days that followed, however, investigators became increasingly focused on inconsistencies in the scene and in Darlie's account. Forensic experts who examined the crime scene testified about the patterns of blood evidence in ways that they argued were not consistent with an intruder scenario. An expert testified that the nature of certain blood evidence on Darlie's clothing suggested body movement inconsistent with her account of events. The prosecution built a case around the theory that Darlie Routier had taken the lives of her own sons, that financial pressures in the household and her own self-focused personality had combined into a motive, and that the injuries she had sustained were self-inflicted to support her story. 12 days after the crime, Darlie was arrested. Her trial began in January 1997. One of the most discussed pieces of evidence at trial was a video recording of a birthday celebration held at the boys' graveside 1 week after their deaths, in which Darlie was captured laughing, dancing, and spraying silly string over the graves. Darlie has always maintained that the video was taken out of context and that the birthday party had been intended as a celebration of Devin's life, that she had been advised it would be a good way to honor him. The prosecution used the footage to argue that her emotional responses were not those of a grieving mother. On February 4, 1997, the jury found Darlie Routier guilty of the capital murder of Damon and sentenced her to death. She has been on death row in Texas ever since, currently held at the Patrick O'Daniel unit in Gatesville. She has never stopped maintaining her innocence, and her case has attracted sustained attention from people who believe the investigation was flawed, that the forensic evidence was misinterpreted, and that the real perpetrator was never identified. Requests for DNA testing of evidence from the crime scene have been submitted and debated in courts for years. Devin and Damon Routier were 6 and 5 years old. Whether the full truth of what happened in that home has ever been established remains, for many people who have studied the case carefully, an open question. Number 7. Megan Huntsman, the mother who carried a secret for 18 years. For 18 years, Megan Huntsman carried a secret that she shared with nobody. Not with her family, not with her friends, not with the neighbors who lived alongside her in Pleasant Grove, Utah. Not even with her husband, who later told investigators he had no knowledge of what had been happening inside their home. It was a secret that only came to light in April 2014 when her estranged husband Darren West, recently released from prison on drug-related charges, returned to the family's former home to collect some belongings and clean out the garage. Inside that garage, packed into cardboard boxes and wrapped carefully, West found something that would upend everything anyone thought they knew about the woman he had once been married to. He called 911. When police arrived and searched the garage, they found the remains of 7 infants. 6 of those babies, investigators would determine, had been taken from the world immediately after being born. A 7th appeared to have been stillborn. All of them were the biological children of Megan Huntsman and Darren West. The babies had been born between 1996 and 2006, a period of 10 years during which the household had also been raising 3 daughters who survived and grew up apparently unaware of what their mother had done. When investigators interviewed Megan Huntsman, she initially insisted that the first baby found had been stillborn. As the scope of what had been discovered became impossible to explain away, she eventually acknowledged what she had done. She told investigators that she had been heavily dependent on methamphetamine during that period of her life, that her husband had been largely absent and eventually incarcerated, and that each time she had found herself pregnant and given birth, she had felt herself incapable of caring for another child. She pleaded guilty in February 2015 to 6 counts of murder. At her sentencing hearing in April 2015, Megan Huntsman made a brief statement in which she said she could not fully explain her own actions even to herself, that she felt it would be dishonest to blame only the drugs and the depression, and that she was aware that nothing she said could come close to addressing the magnitude of what she had done. The judge, who stated that he had never encountered a case like this in his years on the bench, sentenced her to 6 terms of 5 years to life in prison, ordering 3 of those terms to be served consecutively. Prosecutors indicated they did not believe she would ever be released. Her first parole hearing is not scheduled until 2064, at which point she would be 89 years old. The 3 daughters who grew up in that home have had to build their lives in the shadow of a truth about their mother that none of them knew. And the 6 babies who were never given names by the world they briefly entered are remembered now only by the circumstances of how they were found. Number 8. Deborah Green, the doctor who set fire to her own house with her children inside. Deborah Green was a physician, board-certified in internal medicine, trained at a respected institution, the kind of professional whose career represents years of discipline and dedication to the welfare of others. She and her husband Michael Farrar, also a doctor, had built a life in the affluent suburb of Prairie Village, Kansas, raising 3 children named Timothy, Kate, and Kelly in a large and comfortable home. By the early 1990s, however, that life had begun to fracture badly. Deborah had stepped back from her medical practice. She was struggling with chronic pain, insomnia, and periods of severe depression. She had developed a significant dependence on alcohol. Her marriage was deteriorating rapidly, and by the summer of 1995 Michael Farrar had decided he wanted a divorce and had begun a relationship with another woman. What happened next unfolded across 2 distinct and devastating tracks. On the first track, Michael Farrar began experiencing episodes of severe and unexplained illness, nausea, vomiting, weakness, symptoms that doctors struggled to attribute to any identifiable cause and that would improve when he was away from home and worsen when he returned. It was eventually discovered, after forensic investigation, that he had been repeatedly exposed to ricin, a deadly toxin derived from castor beans, which investigators concluded had been introduced into his food at home. Packets of castor beans were discovered in Deborah's purse. On the second track, on the night of October 24, 1995, a devastating fire broke out at the family home in Prairie Village. Deborah and her 10-year-old daughter Kate escaped the blaze. 13-year-old Timothy and 6-year-old Kelly did not. Fire investigators examined the scene and found trails of accelerant leading back to Deborah's bedroom, along with burn patterns consistent with fires having been set deliberately in multiple locations throughout the house. Deborah was arrested on November 22, 1995. She was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Timothy and Kelly, 2 counts of attempted murder including the poisoning of Michael Farrar, and 1 count of aggravated arson. She entered a no-contest plea in 1996, which carried the same legal weight as a guilty verdict, in a deal that allowed her to avoid the possibility of the death penalty. She was sentenced to 40 years in prison, effectively a life sentence. She has been incarcerated at the Topeka Correctional Facility in Kansas. Over the years, her attorneys have attempted to challenge the conviction, arguing that advances in arson investigation science since 1995 cast doubt on the evidence of deliberate fire setting, but those efforts have not resulted in a new trial or an overturned conviction. Timothy Farrar was 13 years old and Kelly Farrar was 6. They were asleep in their home on the night that fire moved through it, and the person who was supposed to be their greatest protection was the one who had set it in motion. Number 9. Ray Dawn Smith, the mother who let her daughter down when it mattered most. Kelsey Shelton Smith Briggs was born on December 28, 2002 in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, to parents Ray Dawn Smith and Lance Briggs, who were already divorced at the time of her birth. For the first 2 years of her life, Kelsey appeared to be a healthy and happy child, living primarily with her mother and maintaining a relationship with her father's family. The period before January 2005 contained no reported signs of any concern about her welfare. Then in January 2005, Kelsey was brought to a local emergency room with a broken collarbone and multiple bruises across her body. The Oklahoma Department of Human Services opened a case and began monitoring the household. Over the months that followed, Kelsey continued to suffer injuries that medical professionals identified as consistent with abuse. In April 2005, both of her legs were found to be broken, spiral fractures at different stages of healing, which medical examiners determined had been caused by abuse over time rather than by a single incident. Following that discovery, Kelsey was placed into the custody of the Oklahoma Department of Human Services. Then on June 15, 2005, despite a recommendation from the department against the placement, a district judge returned Kelsey to the home of her mother Ray Dawn Smith and her stepfather Michael Lee Porter. The judge stated that the identity of the person responsible for Kelsey's previous injuries was unknown. On October 11, 2005, Kelsey Shelton Smith Briggs died at the home she shared with her mother and stepfather in Meeker, Oklahoma. She was 2 years old. Her death was ruled a homicide caused by blunt force trauma to the abdomen. Michael Lee Porter was initially charged with first-degree murder and sexual assault. In February 2007, he pleaded guilty to enabling child abuse in exchange for those more serious charges being dropped, and he was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Ray Dawn Smith was tried separately on charges of enabling child abuse, that she had known or should have known that her daughter was being harmed and had failed to protect her. On July 18, 2007, the jury found Ray Dawn Smith guilty. She was sentenced to 27 years in prison. In 2024, after serving 17 years, she applied to the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board for commutation of her sentence, arguing that she had not been the one who harmed Kelsey and that her sentence was unjust. The board denied her request. Kelsey's paternal grandfather Royce Briggs attended the hearing and stated that he believed the judge and jury had gotten it right. Kelsey's case became a catalyst for significant reform in Oklahoma's Child Protective Services system, and a law was passed in her name aimed at preventing the kind of systemic failures that had allowed her to remain in danger for so long. Kelsey Smith Briggs was 2 years old. She had been seen, documented, monitored, and returned, and none of the systems that were supposed to protect her were able to do so in time. Number 10. Teresa Knorr, the mother whose crimes went unseen for nearly a decade. The crimes of Teresa Knorr did not come to light through a police investigation or a concerned neighbor or a tip to a hotline. They came to light in 1993 because her youngest surviving daughter Terry, having carried the weight of what she had witnessed for years, watched an episode of America's Most Wanted that featured the unsolved case of an unidentified young woman whose remains had been found in a remote area of California in 1984, and recognized in that case the story of her own sister. Teresa Jimmy Francine Knorr was born in Sacramento, California in 1946. She married multiple times and had 6 children across those relationships. By the late 1970s, she was raising those children largely alone, and the environment inside the Knorr household had become one defined by fear, control, and escalating abuse. Teresa was described by those who knew the family as paranoid, deeply controlling, and capable of extraordinary cruelty toward the people who depended on her entirely. She directed the most severe treatment toward her daughters, particularly Suzanne and Sheila, whom she appeared to resent with an intensity that her surviving children later described as rooted in envy. Teresa seemed unable to tolerate her daughters growing older, becoming more confident, or drawing any attention that she felt should belong to her. In 1983, during a heated argument, Teresa shot Suzanne in the chest with a small caliber pistol. Suzanne survived the shooting. Teresa refused to allow her to receive medical attention, and the bullet remained in Suzanne's body as she recovered at home without professional care. In the summer of 1984, the situation escalated again. Teresa decided that Suzanne needed to leave the household, but she became convinced that the bullet still inside Suzanne's body could be used as evidence against her if Suzanne ever reported what had happened. She enlisted her sons Robert and William to help her remove the bullet. Following that procedure, Suzanne's condition deteriorated severely. On July 16, 1984, Teresa Knorr had her sons take Suzanne to a remote area near Lake Tahoe, California, where they left her. Suzanne Marlene Knorr was 17 years old. Her burned remains were found in that area and remained unidentified for nearly a decade. Less than a year later, in June 1985, Teresa's daughter Sheila, who had managed to briefly leave the household, was brought back. Sheila Gay Sanders, 20 years old, died inside the family home in circumstances that the surviving children described as confinement and deprivation over an extended period. Her remains were also taken to a remote area and left. They too went unidentified for years. The family moved out of Sacramento in 1986, and most of Teresa's surviving children cut contact with her in the years that followed. Terry Noor had attempted multiple times to get law enforcement to take her account seriously, but was not believed until 1993, when the America's Most Wanted connection gave investigators a concrete thread to follow. Teresa Noor was arrested on November 10, 1993 in Salt Lake City, Utah, where she had been living under her maiden name and working as a caretaker. She was extradited to California and charged with the murders of Susan and Sheila. She pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in prison. She is currently incarcerated at the California Institution for Women in Chino. Her sons Robert and William were also charged in connection with the crimes. For nearly a decade, 2 young women lay in remote California soil as unidentified Jane does while their mother lived freely, and it was only because one surviving daughter refused to stop carrying the truth that the world eventually learned who they were.